Now, for the remainder of this lecture on colonial America, I'm going to be discussing the 13 colonies by region. I think this is a little better way to organize the colonies instead of by chronology, because they certainly have a greater affinity for each other the closer they are to each other. So I'm going to discuss the northern colonies, which is really the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and then finish with the southern colonies. So by the northern colonies, we can mean New England. This would be Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. We have already discussed the formation of the Plymouth colony, founded in 1620 by a group of pilgrims. And then we can talk about the rest of the colony, which becomes known as the Massachusetts Bay colony. And we can date the beginning of the Massachusetts Bay colony, particularly with 1630, with the founding of Boston. Whereas Plymouth is founded by a group of pilgrims who are interested in separating from the Church of England and take this pilgrimage to come to the New World. Massachusetts Bay, most of the other settlements in Massachusetts were founded by Puritans. The Puritans, of course, are the important figures who wanted to purify the church in England. They believed that the Anglican Church had become too Catholic in England, and they wanted to purify the church and instead of completely break from it. However, the irony here, of course, is that these Puritans indeed do separate from the church and journey to the New World. American Puritanism is going to be one of the most important shaping forces for American identity and for subsequent United States history. American Puritanism, with its desire to create a pure society, and its emphasis on the individual conscious and individual relationship, but also democratic church government in the form of congregationalism, obviously is going to have important strands of thought for subsequent American history. So the Puritans, after the founding of Plymouth, established many settlements along the Massachusetts coast, including Newbury, Ipswich, Salem, Lynn, Newtown, but the most famous of these, of course, is Boston. In 1630, the Winthrop Fleet, as it is called, 11 ships with 1,000 Puritans arrive in what will become Boston Harbor and set up settlements in the harbor in this natural port that is formed on the coast of Massachusetts. So this map is instructive for us today because all of the green that you see here indicates original landforms that were there when the Puritans landed and during the American Revolution. The darker blue indicates landfill areas, areas that are later filled in with dirt. They might have been marshy areas or indeed part of the harbor, very shallow areas, and they are gradually expanded, reclaiming this land from the river, from the harbor, and from the ocean. So you can see that much of what is today Boston's Logan Airport was originally water, as is much of the waterfront today, and the very famous Back Bay neighborhood was a very marshy, swampy area connected to the Charles River. All of that is filled in, so we have a much larger city of Boston today than what the Puritans encountered in 1630. Where the Puritans settle are the areas of what we would call Charlestown, Dorchester, and the Shawmut Peninsula. What we call downtown Boston today was originally this peninsula called Shawmut. On the Shawmut Peninsula, the Puritans find clean drinking water, a spring there, and as a result, purchase some land there and begin settlement. This is what the area of Boston would have looked like more so in the years after the Puritan settlement, where the main settlement is, of course, on the peninsula and along Boston Neck. Boston, of course, is filled with some of the most famous of the Puritans who come to the New World. One of the most famous families in colonial America are the Mathers. All of them were ministers. Richard Mather and his son Increase Mather was also a minister, as was Increase's son Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is going to be a rather prominent figure. He's a very extensive writer and preacher. Also is going to be significant with the Salem witch trials. Also, John Cotton and John Wilson were two other prominent Boston ministers as well. Congregationalism was the form of government in American Puritanism, in Puritan New England. So whereas the Anglican Church, the king was the head of the church and appointed the archbishop and other bishops, whereas in Presbyterianism, the presbyters or elders are in charge of the church. In a congregational church, the congregation is in charge. So the congregation would vote on issues of when to form a new church, when to build a new church building, and they would also vote on when to call a new minister. And so this tradition of congregationalism in New England Puritanism is obviously going to play a formative role in the development of American character and American democratic institutions. We can see that also in the writing of the Massachusetts Body of Liberties by the Massachusetts General Court. Now, Massachusetts initially is not a royal colony. It is a chartered colony, as are the other New England colonies. That means a company has come together and received permission or a charter from the king in order to create this colony. They elect their own governor and they elect their own deputies that will serve in the legislature, which is strangely called the General Court. So the court system and the legislative branch, if you will, are fused together in colonial Massachusetts, and the General Court, or legislature, would work with the governor. And one of the things the General Court passes in 1641 is the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. We might see this also as the first example of a constitution in the New World. In North America, we see ideas such as constitutionalism in the Mayflower Compact, now in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties as well, which laid out how the government was to work and how elected officials were to behave and be elected, how long they would serve as well. And so the center of political life in colonial Boston was at the State House. This is where the General Court would meet, located on State Street. A lot of key events are going to occur in and around this building. The building still remains today on State Street in modern Boston, with modern buildings surrounding it. Very prominent figure in the establishment of Boston and New England Puritanism was John Winthrop. John Winthrop was a lawyer from England, and he had extensive legal experience and has a large family, and concerned about the welfare of his community and the corruption of the church and the desire to start a new godly covenantal community. Winthrop is one of the very significant leaders that leads this group of Puritans that arrives in the Boston area in 1630. John Winthrop is going to serve as governor of Massachusetts for 12 of the colony's first 20 years. The only reason that the people of Massachusetts stop electing him as governor is because they just feel like someone else ought to have a chance. There was nothing that tarnished his term as governor or his administration. Later on, one of his sons will be a founder of the colony of Connecticut. But John Winthrop delivers perhaps one of the most important sermons in American history. It is called A Model of Christian Charity. That was the official name, and he delivers it on the decks of the Arbella before the Puritans land in 1630. And one of the most important quotes introduces an image that's going to be important for subsequent American history. He says in the sermon, "For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." That image of a city upon a hill, taken from the prophet Isaiah, becomes a very powerful image in American history. What Winthrop was saying is that what they were creating here as a covenantal community, covenanting with each other and covenanting with their God, to be unique, to be exceptional, to be a godly community, to look after each other, to take care of each other, to defend themselves, and to enforce godliness in their community would be a light to the rest of the world. And if they are faithful, God would bless them. If they were not faithful, God would punish them. Now, that image of a city upon a hill will later give fuel to a very prominent idea in American history, which is American exceptionalism. The idea that there is something different or exceptional about America, about the United States, that is to be a light to the rest of the world. That somehow America is different either through its constitutionalism or its free market system or its Christianity that is going to be a leader for the rest of the world. That image, whether or not people have fully adopted the concept of American exceptionalism, is rife throughout a lot of American speeches. It is used by numerous presidents, including Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, and it's still an important idea today. So John Winthrop is a very important leader early in the colony. His home was recently found in Charlestown. The cobblestone foundations are what remains, and he is buried today in the King's Burial Ground in downtown Boston. Boston goes back and forth with Philadelphia as the largest city in colonial America. Depending on what year you're talking about, it's either Boston or Philadelphia has the largest population. Both are, of course, very important port cities with large wharfs, and a lot of the shipping and trade in the British Empire is in one shape or another going through Boston, including here at Long Wharf, right next to Griffin's Wharf. Boston is also the home to the first public school in American history. This is the Boston Latin School in 1635. It's just a one-room schoolhouse, the location of which is demarcated on one of the sidewalks in downtown Boston today. The Boston Latin School is in continual existence all the way back to 1635. Still today, high school students at the Boston Latin School are required to take 4 years of Latin in order to graduate from the school. Boston is also home to the oldest university in the country, and this is, of course, Harvard College. It is the desire of the Puritans to make sure that a godly ministers are established in the colony that would faithfully preach the scriptures and preach the gospel. And in order to do that, they see it as necessary to create a seminary for the training of those ministers. And so a new college established in the town of Newtown across the Charles River, later renamed Cambridge, is created for the purpose of training Puritan ministers. Later, Newtown College is renamed Harvard College because John Harvard, a Puritan minister, donates 300 books from his theological library to the school, and so the school is renamed after John Harvard. Still today, the location of where some of those books are located remains in the library at Harvard University. And so Harvard becomes the first university in the country to train ministers in Puritan theology and in the teaching of the scriptures. And of course, Harvard is going to be the home, the university for many American presidents, as well as Supreme Court justices and a lot of prominent figures in American history. Boston is also home to Faneuil Hall, which was founded by Peter Faneuil, who is a French Huguenot who comes to the New World for his faith, and it becomes an important marketplace. And now today, Faneuil Hall and its accompanying Quincy Marketplace is one of the busiest tourist sites in the world, with visitors and tourists coming to Boston, particularly in the summer. Massachusetts is also, of course, home to my hometown, which is Amesbury, founded in 1642. Amesbury is probably the northernmost town in Massachusetts. It touches the New Hampshire border. Originally, it was it's the neighboring town of Salisbury, but it is split in 1642. And as we proceed through American history, I'll frequently reference my hometown and the significance of it in key events in American history. Here's a plaque in town commemorating some of the earliest founders of the town of Amesbury, which is located on the banks of the Merrimack River, right next to Newburyport and Salisbury. Now, not everyone is happy with the Puritan leadership and the Puritan ministers of the government of Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts, in many ways, has a close relationship between the ministers, between the pastors in the city, and its political leadership. And so those that disagree or dissent with that leadership become known as the dissenters. Some of the key dissenters include Roger Williams. Roger Williams was also a pastor in the Boston area, but he is a very vocal critic and demands that there should be a separation of church and state, that the church should have no influence over the government. And more, he excludes people from his fellowship, denying them communion. The Lord's Supper continually comes into constant conflict with the Boston Puritan leadership. And despite John Winthrop's best attempts to reconcile with Roger Williams, eventually Williams is banished from the colony and he leaves, and he will be the founder of the colony of Rhode Island, founding Rhode Island as a colony more along with his ideas and a refuge, particularly for Baptists in the New World. Another prominent dissenter in colonial Boston is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson held Bible studies and prayer meetings in her own home and began to teach groups of women and some men with her ideas. Anne Hutchinson identified herself as an antinomian. An antinomian believes that you don't have to follow the law. You don't have to obey the law if you have the Spirit of God in you. If you've been truly regenerated and saved, you just need to obey the voice of the Spirit. And she introduces a very controversial idea that the Spirit of God is speaking to her and not necessarily to the Puritan leadership. And she is the beneficiary of special revelation from God himself. So this comes in conflict with the leadership of the Puritans and the absolute authority, the general revelation of the Scriptures. And after a very public trial, she is eventually banished from the colony. She will proceed and end up in what we would call the Bronx today, where she dies in an Indian massacre and is buried today. The other famous dissenter in colonial Boston is Mary Dyer. Mary Dyer was a Quaker. Quakers are not accepted in colonial Boston. Quakers were known for disrupting Puritan church services. They are a persecuted sect in England as they are in Puritan New England. But Mary Dyer, promoting her Quaker beliefs, was banished from colonial Massachusetts 3 times. When she returns the 4th time, she is given trial again, and eventually she is hanged on Boston Common. So Williams, Hutchinson, and Dyer are the most famous dissenters from the Puritan leadership in colonial Massachusetts. Now, there is a great question that historians wrestle with regarding Puritan New England. We've identified the Puritan mission and this image of the city upon a hill in which the Puritans come to covenant with each other in order to create a godly society in which they hope God will bless them, they will be a light to the nations. They have sacrificed a great many things, abandoned their homes and fields and possessions and often wealth and reputations in England to come to the wilderness. They actually called their mission an errand in the wilderness sometimes to create this godly community. But once they have their children who didn't have to sacrifice so much for this mission, and particularly their grandchildren who are born in colonial America and grow up in New England, There's this question: does the second and third generation gradually spiritually decline away from the original spiritual mission? Do they care less about godly things and reading the scriptures and searching their hearts to know that indeed their souls have been saved? Perhaps evidence of that is the formation of the Halfway Covenant in 1662. By the 1660s, it becomes evident to a lot of Puritan ministers that people are joining the churches and partaking of the Lord's Supper, which is supposed to be only for the redeemed, only for the regenerate, and they are members of the church and therefore allowed to vote. And this is becoming very concerning for the ministers, that how come we are offering the Lord's Supper to people that we clearly know are not saved, are not regenerated. But the problem is, if you deny them the Lord's Supper and deny them church membership, then you're also denying them, in a sense, political involvement and political citizenship, because to vote in colonial New England, you had to be a member of the church. And so a group of Puritan ministers, including Solomon Stoddard from Northampton, Massachusetts, are instrumental in crafting what becomes known as the Halfway Covenant, in which members of the church could be halfway in the church, if you will, in the sense that they can be a member of the church, they can attend church services, hear the sermons, and hopefully come to a place of regeneration. But they are also going to be halfway out of the church in the sense that they will be denied the Lord's Supper. If there is no proof of a holy lifestyle and that they are saved, then ministers will refuse the Lord's Supper to them. So I think there's a good possibility that the Halfway Covenant does indicate that spiritual decline in spiritual fervor is occurring in New England, that they have to resort to this measure. Perhaps another example of declension in colonial New England are the famous Salem witch trials, which predominate in 1692. This has been a series of events that has been extensively studied by historians, and numerous interpretations have been offered how to understand this event. What we know is that approximately 100 people were suddenly accused of witchcraft in and about 1692 and were put on trial, of which 19 of them, predominantly women, but not exclusively, were hanged on the charge and conviction of witchcraft. And that eventually, most of Boston and the surrounding area around Salem believe that the accusations have gotten out of control and that the trials and the accusations need to cease. Those are the facts that pretty much everybody agrees on. How to understand these events is, of course, something different. What we do know is that a minister in Salem Village, what we would call Danvers, Massachusetts today, named Samuel Parris, had a few daughters living at his parsonage and also a Haitian servant. And suddenly, his daughters are afflicted with all type of shrieking and contorted bodies and crying out in pain and claiming that they had been bewitched, that they had been cursed by a local woman who they accuse of bewitching them. And it takes great prayer and patience that eventually these girls are alleviated from their condition, but the accusation remains that someone had afflicted them with witchcraft. And so as a result, the accusation of these teenage girls leads to some local neighbors being put on trial for witchcraft. They are held in prison until the time of their trial. And sometimes other neighbors emerge and come forth and accuse them of witchcraft as well, insinuating that they saw them participating in a witch's Sabbath, which is a witch's meeting, or performing rites, or pledging loyalty to the devil, or that they had a witch's mark on their bodies. One of the individuals accused, also from my hometown, known as Susanna Martin. Susanna Martin was an older woman who lived in a house demarcated by this rock in Amesbury, Massachusetts. And she is accused of witchcraft and determined by Cotton Mather to be one of the absolute worst offenders in this case. And so as a result, in 1692, she is hanged for the crime of witchcraft as well in Salem Village. After a flurry of accusations and convictions, in the end, 19 people are executed on a charge of witchcraft by the end of 1692. They are predominantly women, but not exclusively. One of them was Giles Corey, who famously was laid down and then had a door put upon him and then large rocks put upon the door in order to crush his chest cavity. So what are we to make of the Salem witch trials? Numerous books, as I said, hundreds of books have been written to try to interpret this event, and there have been numerous interpretations, including political divisions within Salem town and Salem village, economic reasons, jealousy of neighbors. There have been more gendered interpretations of this event in which a climate of sexism presides, and therefore that's the reason it was mostly women who are accused of these events. Other more spiritual interpretations have been advanced that indeed Satan himself was attacking the New England Puritans, and it manifested itself in the form of witchcraft. It's a very difficult event to interpret, but in the end, what is clear is that there is division and dissension, accusation, and definitely at least some false accusation in the colony, which does seem to indicate a sliding away or a decline of fervor regarding the original Puritan mission of creating a city on a hill. What we should make clear about the Salem witch trials is that the ministers of New England are involved in the investigation and the conviction and the execution of some of these people accused of witchcraft, but it is also the spiritual leadership of the colony that stops the accusations and realizes the trials have gotten out of control. One notable figure in this endeavor is Samuel Sewall. Samuel Sewall was a New England Puritan minister. He will later publicly apologize for his role and admit that events got out of control and needed to be reeled in. Moving on from Massachusetts, among the northern or New England colonies, we can mention Rhode Island, which is to the immediate south of Massachusetts, which was founded in 1636 in large part by the very same Roger Williams, who was banished as a dissenter from colonial New England. Roger Williams conducts his relationship with the local native tribes differently than many of the Puritans and Pilgrims, in the sense that he negotiates a real estate deal with the local Narragansett tribe to purchase much of the land that will become Providence, the city of Providence, and buys land from the Indians rather simply than taking it through military endeavors. So Roger Williams arrives in 1644, receives a charter from the Parliament for the establishment of this colony. The Parliament is quite okay with reeling in the influence and the dominance of the Puritans in neighboring Massachusetts. And so Rhode Island particularly in many ways will become a Baptist colony. And by Baptist, what we can mean is those who are independent of the Anglican Church and not necessarily Puritan. And so we have the founding of the First Baptist Church in America in 1638. Rhode Island also witnesses the construction of another seminary or college for the training of ministers, which is the College of Rhode Island, founded in 1764, later renamed Brown University, which again was founded for the training of ministers. Two other New England colonies we should mention also include New Hampshire, founded in 1623 by a group of Puritans who migrate north and settle in towns such as Dover, Exeter, Hampton, and also the very important coastal city of Portsmouth. One of the most important settlements in New Hampshire, really in colonial America, is Portsmouth. There is an ideal harbor, natural harbor that is created in and around Portsmouth, and Strawberry Bank is one of these colonial settlements that forms the basis of the city of Portsmouth. It is the Puritan minister Eleazar Wheelock who is instrumental in creating the seminary in New Hampshire for the training of Puritan ministers, which eventually will become Dartmouth College, founded in 1769. To the south of Massachusetts, Connecticut is founded in 1623 by one of the sons of John Winthrop, with its capital at Hartford and important port cities at New Haven and also Saybrook. Connecticut, of course, an abundance of available land. Thomas Hooker is given credit for expanding the colony, known as the father of Connecticut. He promotes universal Christian suffrage, so if you subscribe to any type of Christian church, then you would have a vote in the colony of Connecticut. And he's also instrumental in drafting what is often claimed to be the first real constitution in American history, and that is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Sometimes Connecticut is referred to as the Constitution State. And the reason is because they are claiming that the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, with its details about how to be elected to office and how the government, the legislature, the governor's powers are constituted in his term of office, that this is the first constitution in American history. Connecticut also has a college for the training of Puritan ministers, and this is founded by Elihu Yale in 1701, which is, of course, Yale College, and the formation of Yale Divinity School. Now, the New England colonies, particularly Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, fight a very intense war in the 1675 to 1676 known as King Philip's War. As English settlers continued to move inland, away from the coast, they continued to move or encroach onto native lands, and natives strike back with attacks against English settlements. The leader of this confederacy of Indians that go up and down the Connecticut River, but all the way down to Narragansett Bay, is Metacomet. His English name is King Philip. And so there are very large battles between Puritans and natives across western Massachusetts. There's a very famous massacre that occurs at Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1675, but rather large pitched battles and in swamps all across Rhode Island, into Connecticut, and across the south shore of Massachusetts. The end result of this is the destruction of this Indian Confederacy and the failure of King Philip to maintain control over these lands, and gradually the English, meaning the Puritans particularly, are moving inland, taking over more control of land. Now, you remember that Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, these are chartered colonies. They are not royal colonies, so the king does not appoint the governor. But in 1686, with James II, the very unpopular king on the throne of England, James II endeavors to impose a greater degree of royal control over the colonies by establishing what is called the Dominion of New England. Basically, what happens is all the New England colonies lose their charters. They now become royal colonies, and Sir Edmund Andros is appointed as the royal governor over this very large province. This, for the locals, this really represents a curtailment of their liberties that they have been enjoying and a lot of the independence that they had become quite fond of. Now, when James II himself is toppled from his throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and forced to flee England, it also leads to the fall of Sir Edmund Andros in the colonies, in which he is actually arrested, and the charters are wisely restored by King William and Queen Mary with the after the Glorious Revolution. And so what we see here is the Puritans in New England already at this very early date are particularly fond of their liberties and their independence, and that, of course, will be a growing affection over the next 100 years, eventually leading to the American Revolution.